this for him.
Hmm.
So I haven't done that before, so I think I just need to press that button and then figure out at the end how to get it saved. So he's hoping anyway to be able to watch this. All right, well, it's good to be back. It's good to see everybody. I felt a little like we might need to acknowledge the shooting from yesterday. I don't know if that's on your heart and minds, but was listening again to some of that this morning and just feeling as though if you all are willing, I'd like to just offer a prayer and for us to just pause for a moment to reflect on that and before we start in on the work in front of us for today. So I wrote just a short prayer. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with that for us to pray together. God, today we sit again beside the waters of sorrow and despair. We hear voices that hold us captive in their pain and their anguish. How long, O God? Hear the cry of the brokenhearted, the angry, and the lost. May your spirit make its presence known in courageous action, in compassionate presence, and in discerning leadership. Amen. Maybe those of us who sent our kids off to school today, supremely aware. Well, the work we have in front of us today, really, this is about you all. I had said to Molly yesterday, last year we didn't actually have a Zoom session designed around this, but we had quite a bit of conversation last year and we extended the deadline of the paper. You all are kind of getting the benefit of a little bit of that from working through some things last year. So this is really your time. So we're not looking for a right answer, or we're not looking for you to have everything all together, but it's your time to be able to talk out loud about what you're thinking about and then be able to hear feedback. And hopefully that helps you in the process of being able to more clearly articulate a theology for your ministry leadership and what that looks like. So it's one of those bold, brave things where somebody just gets to volunteer and jump right in there. I think, we can think about it in terms of 10 or 15 minutes if we go that long on each person. If not, that's fine too. But for you to present your outline and any other thinking that you've done since you posted that outline and invite feedback or ask questions where you're wondering if something is making sense or however you'd like to do it. It's kind of your time, and we'll companion with you in this journey and hopefully offer helpful words as you're starting in on this process. So I could draft someone, but I'll leave a little bit of space for someone to just volunteer and jump in.
I'm willing to go first.
All right, Jay.
So this is just a word on process. This is interesting for me. Typically, I discover my thesis statement somewhere in the middle of writing or closer to the end. And almost always, even with my weekly sermons and probably every paper I've ever written, start with the end in mind, and I begin working backwards. It's like doing a math problem with a calculator. I get the answer, and then I figure out how we got there. So this was actually quite challenging, but I enjoyed doing it this way. I think it'll be a help if I can develop papers like this in this program. So I began with my thesis statement, and I was responding to a comment that you made, Sherry, on a week or so ago, and I kind of allowed your comment to guide my thinking. And so the thesis statement is ministry leadership infused with missional and Trinitarian values empowers the local church to take an active role in the unfolding story of God. And so the missional and Trinitarian values is a direct outflow from our learning in this class, and ministry leadership is really the topic and the goal here. The second part of that, which I'll touch on at the end of the outline, the church taking the active role in the unfolding story of God, is a possible dissertation topic for me, which is worship as God's story, and the way that trying to, and I'm not there yet, obviously, but the way worship can enhance the way we experience God's story, so that we can be a better narrative piece in telling God's story in the world, something along those lines. My first section is theological foundations for ministry leadership. And this is a section that very easily maybe should be expanded upon, but I just put down some of the first things that come to my mind when building a theological foundation for that, which is the call to ministry and the priesthood of all believers. There are some ABC distinctives there that I hold close to my heart. The Great Commandment and the Great Commission. And then what I need to do is, in those examples and probably some others, highlight the role of highlight the Trinitarian aspects of those scriptures, because that will inform the rest of the paper moving forward. The second section is a theological framework for Trinitarian theology and ministry leadership. And then I wrote down just a few things there, again, can easily expand this. But self-sacrifice, or a self-giving type of life, giving away self-interests for the betterment of the community to advance God's mission. But then to be a good giver, you must also be a good receiver. And I think sometimes the best gift that we can give someone is to receive what they are offering. It's to be, even when that's challenging to do. So the gift of receiving. And then I wanted to highlight diversity in worship, especially in my context where we are all very similar to one another. So to highlight and to figure out ways to live into the diversity that exists among us, so that we will be better at inviting diversity into our congregation. And so theologically, we are quite diverse already. And then the next section is a theological framework, missional values. And so we have a theology of justice, and then flowing from that, egalitarian beliefs and their impact on the way I believe worship should look, the way our lives should be led, and the way we should approach the world. And then perhaps being influenced a little bit by Parker or Henry Nouwen, hospitality, the open and inviting nature that I think undergirds missional life for the church, specifically as it relates to ministry leadership. And then the last section is theological framework for worship, the empowered church, and the story of God. This is God's story through worship, and as I said, this is a possible. This is an area in which I'm beginning to an archaeological dig, perhaps on a dissertation topic. But worship, God's story through worship, invites and offers hope. Empowered, we would be people empowered through relational connection with God and with people. Our worship, as with God in all things, should foster creativity and an invitation to others to create. And then we should be a voice against power. We should stand against power and oppression. We should be able to speak power to authority, regardless of that authority. And then finally, as is absolutely essential here, probably informed a great deal by Fiddes, and would be word and table, communal movement, and the invitation into the life of the triune God. And then a conclusion to wrap it all up. And so I have I guess that I would welcome any feedback, any suggestions that anyone has. But because this is new to me, this idea of beginning with this step before writing instead of discovering this as I write, any process guidance that you could offer, any if there's technical advice that you might have as far as what a thesis statement should look like or anything like that would all be very, very welcome. And of course, anything that you have that I can't think of.
I did want to comment, Jay, that I think it's really important, or this is what I feel like you've done in that first section. The call to ministry, priesthood of all believers, the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. I feel like you've named some really important theological foundations that you already have. So, because I think that's really important. I think the goal of this class wasn't to say, oh, you're deficient, here are all the answers. The goal is to say, wow, this is the way, these are things that have been really important to me. Now, what we've done, how does it strengthen it, maybe challenge it, or maybe help me, deepen it? So I think it's really good that you've started by naming, these are the things that are really important to me. Now I'm going to understand how Trinitarian and missional theologies deepen or shape or form that, but I just think it's good that you started with a place of claiming some identity. So I like that.
Thank you.
I think it's a very clear thesis statement, Jay. You know where you're headed, and that's good. And this is very good practice for later when you do the dissertation.
I thought it might be.
That you have a thesis that you want to test. And bring some outcomes. In the second section, theological foundations, I'm interested because you're talking about ministry leadership, and so I'm not clear as to how you're going to articulate. Is this about a pastoral leader, or is this about the whole church as offering ministry leadership? Because the call to ministry and then the priesthood of all believers is juxtaposed there. And so I think in the next section you talk about giving, receiving, so that it is a congregational impulse, it seems, not simply the minister. And so I would hope that you are going to delineate varied roles and in an egalitarian way, but the call to pastoral leadership is different than simply the affirmation of the priesthood of all believers. So,
okay,
you catch what I'm saying? How are you going to delineate those two?
Mm-hmm. Is that something? Do you think maybe I should try to highlight both, or is there? Should I focus
I want to know which one you are highlighting?
Okay.
And how they relate.
Sure.
Okay. You've got them because even though we would affirm the priesthood of all believers, not every congregant views himself or herself as a ministry leader. Yeah. So how are you going to invite that? How are you going to articulate that so that identity is more corporate?
Part of my struggle with this and why this was such a helpful exercise is to delineate between this paper and the next paper, and try to keep the orthodoxy and the orthopraxy apart from each other. So that last little bit about what you said as far as how are we going to do that, is that something I should be working towards to highlight further in the follow-up paper to this one, or is that one you want to see developed a bit more in this paper?
Theological foundations for ministry leadership. Are you talking about pastoral leaders, or are you talking about the congregation?
Okay.
That's unclear to me as to how you are doing an interface between those two.
Okay, I see.
Okay. I would, when you talk about the second, the theological framework, Trinitarian theology, I think that's good. You're going to need to do some articulation of that theologically. and how it grounds missional values. I would encourage you, Jay, to look at Moltmann's Trinity and the Kingdom, because he's the one who talks about the open and inviting Trinity. He provides, I think he's the first one to provide that language, and he could be very helpful to you as you begin to articulate.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Marshall, what was the name of that again?
It's The Trinity and the Kingdom by Jürgen Moltmann. That book, Christy, has really, as much as any other, sparked the Trinitarian renewal. And I think it's very helpful. Another one is Catherine Lacugna, Lacugna, Catherine Lacugna, God with Us. And the last part, Jay, of God with Us is really kind of how to operationalize Trinitarian theology. And so that would be helpful in your next paper. But those are two very important texts as you do Trinitarian theology.
Thank you.
Yes. I like how you're moving toward worship as narrative theology. Worship as a mission is where it seems that you're headed here. And so I look forward to you developing it, Jay.
Okay. Me too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can go next if Jay is satisfied. And
Excuse me, Scotty. Let me say one more thing, Jay. The missional values and the framework for worship. I really hope that the missional values will be clearly carried into your theology of worship.
Okay.
Because that's a really important bit. Theology of justice, egalitarian beliefs, hospitality, etc. How you will actually carry that into the empowered church and the story of God, I think is critical. Okay, Scotty, sorry.
That's all right. Let me pull up my thing here. So obviously, I just did a rather simple outline. I hope that's okay. I don't know. I wouldn't say that I have never. I agree. I mean, I agree with Jay to a certain extent. I have never really wrote what I would say would be a good thesis statement. That was one. Actually, yeah. Actually, that was certainly my biggest struggle during all of my MDiv papers. Was I always had to present bare minimum 3 thesis statements for every paper that one was required for. For some reason, and I mean this is maybe a little bit self-doubt that I have to get over for this, but I just don't feel like that I can say enough in a short thing. But anyway, so I'll just go from there and you all can hopefully help me as we go. So what I wrote as a thesis is the greatest example that we have of leadership within the body of Christ and society as a whole comes from the example of the Trinitarian nature of God, especially in the way that we see Jesus living within the Trinity during his earthly ministry. We need to take this example and lead according to the example of Jesus from day to day within each of our context. This forms us to be leaders that are always leading from a place of mutual, unified, yet diverse and creative cultivated relationships. From a theological perspective, this is the authentic Christ-like way to lead. And in the outline, of course, the first point, how did Jesus lead? I wanted to really look in the Gospels and sort of start a foundation with looking at the Gospels. And so just for an example, I started with John 10, leading from a place of unity with God. Matthew 1, Jesus leading as the fullness of all that God was and wanted to be with humanity. And then, of course, even as Jay mentioned, Matthew 28, Jesus led for the sake of the triune God and God's mission on the earth. And then the second part, how are we to lead like Jesus? I want to specifically look into Fittest chapter 2, by creating and cultivating community the way the triune God does. And then from joining the dance, chapter 4, by allowing the Holy Spirit to empower us to be and do more than we could ever do on our own. And then C, just simply by submission to the will of God. And then the final part, how will this kind of leadership begin to form our congregations or organizations? Looking into chapter 8 and reviewing leadership, the focus of the ministry and the mission of congregation or organization should be a global focus for the purpose of God's mission in the whole earth. So a movement from only a local mindset to a global mindset. The second thing, each member of the church should be able to find where they fit into the mission of God. So certainly, as Jay mentioned as well, priesthood of all believers language. And then the last thing there, looking into Fittest chapter 9, allowing, and I think Jay kind of touched on this as well, allowing the sacraments of the church to form us into persons that are willing and able to participate in the mission of God on the earth. So I think I feel like that the bulk of my material, honestly, will come from Fittest. I am just really drawn to him as a Baptist, doing as much work as he does and calling it sacrament. That's very interesting to me in all of this. And then the whole thing about community as well. But so.
Yeah. You want to go first, Sherry?
Well, I wondered if any of the missional piece, do you see it weaving its way in here anywhere, Scotty, from the missional leader and some of that vocabulary and language or thought?
Yeah. So I guess the balance that I'm trying to achieve is to be as much focused on the formation of the congregation as much as I am my own. And so because of that, and because I think that is, personally, I think that's more important. So hopefully, as I continue.
Well, hang on just a second. Can you say that again? You're talking about making a distinction between the formation of the congregation and personal formation?
No, I don't know that it. I mean, I hope I don't write it or think on it as if it's a distinction. Maybe I am, but more so that it's just. So I don't want to get to a place where I feel like. So for example, like the Palmer book, what I hope would be to get to a place of balance. To this point, and this maybe is some of my own bias that I need to kind of get rid of for this paper, certainly, is I am just falling in love with Fittest. And so I haven't spent as much and I had already read Joining the Dance prior to this class, several years ago. So I guess part of it is because I really enjoy Fittest. That's just sort of where I've been concentrating. So obviously with this feedback, I will look better into the missional leader, and certainly will be fitting some of the pieces into that for sure.
I do understand, Scotty, the balance that you're talking about in terms of congregational formation and personal formation. The two are intertwined, and it's part of what I was asking Jay earlier in terms of ministry leadership and the priesthood of all believers. How do those interface? They are distinctive. realities, but then they become inseparable as you do the work of ministry leadership in your congregation. Your focus on the Gospels is good. Your first sentence can be your thesis statement. The rest of that is exegesis, really, as to how you're going to get there. But the first sentence is very important. Now you know that you're going to have to connect some dots, because the Gospels don't have a fully orbed Trinitarian theology.
Right.
And so when you talk about seeing Jesus living within the Trinity, you're going to be making some theological constructions there in terms of him not doing anything apart from the power of the Spirit, him not doing anything apart from having a sense that he was sent. And so you're going to have to connect some dots toward Trinitarian theology in the way that you use the Gospels. But from a place of unity with God, excellent. As the fullness of what God wanted and was and wanted to be with humanity, yes. For the sake of the triune God and God's mission on earth. You're making some theological moves there that are implied, but not fully delineated, as you know, within the Gospels, and so that's a good piece. You're talking about a mode of leadership informed by Trinitarian identity, as Word made flesh, and then you seek to move. I think it's a very logical move, using fides, allowing the Spirit, by submission to the will of God. I'm thinking again that Moltmann might help you in terms of Jesus' ultimate self-giving in submission to the will of God.
The Trinity and Kingdom text.
Yeah, Trinity and the Kingdom, and there's one other. I'm going to run over here and just a second.
While she's doing that, Sherry, do you have any advice where maybe some particular chapter or material in the Reviewing Leadership might be helpful with what I'm trying to do?
I don't know. I have to think about that. What about in the rest of you? Do you find any connections in some of the stuff you did in Reviewing Leadership and what Scotty's fleshing out here? You presented on the chapter that had the biblical piece, didn't you?
Right, yes.
Scotty,
Yes.
the Trinity and the Kingdom is good, but the way of Jesus Christ by Moltmann, Christology in his messianic dimensions. He wrote this as a beginning conversation with Judaism, but the actual explication of how Jesus lives his life in obedience to the Abba, I think you would find, and the apocalyptic dimensions, particularly Christ's suffering, righteousness from the suffering of Christ, the divine suffering of God, etc. I think you would find some help for that submission section in that particular text.
Okay.
Messianic Christology. It's it's well done. There's a pattern developing a Moltmann book for every theological question that we ponder. So, yeah, you got it. I think he helped reset the language of participation. Fitness, I think, is dependent upon the earlier work of Moltmann in that way. So, both of whom are dependent upon Barth.
I think, Scotty, when you get down to exploring how people fit into the mission of God or encouraging folks to fit into the mission of God, I think the missional leader really speaks to that. Now, it may be that some of what's in the missional leader will fit better in the second paper, but even in this paper, as you're exploring why that matters, I think some of their conversation about that from the missional leader might help in that third section where you want to talk about that a little bit. Anybody else? Offer a word or a thought?
I do think both Jay and Scotty have managed to incorporate what the movement of this course is about in terms of a Trinitarian theology grounding leadership for the sake of forming a congregation, Imago Trinitatis, which is a missional reality. So I think you make the move that we had hoped for.
Dr. Marshall, can you say that statement one more time?
Of course not.
I don't write fast enough.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, I'm suggesting, and I think you've done it as well, Christy, you have made the kind of move that the course wanted you to make, which is to ground ministry leadership in a theology of the Trinity, which moves toward formation of, in your case, a team, a group of students, Imago Trinitatis, into a community that reflects the image of God. And so it is a personal formation of the ministry leader that then gives you the kind of understanding in Trinitarian theology that can ground and shape a community after the likeness of the triune God. And so I'm just affirming that you all have put the pieces of the course together, the spirituality, the leadership, a Trinitarian theological grounding toward the formation of a people. It's not just about you becoming more Trinitarian, more informed in Trinitarian theology. That's part of it. But it's toward what that theological reality does as you form an organization or a congregation.
Mm-hmm.
So. Is that clear now? Clearer, Christy? Yeah.
Oh, it was great. I just wanted to write it down as you were saying.
I said it better the first time, but anyway.
And I think that informs what you said earlier about the pastor and church leadership being distinctive yet inseparable.
Yes. Yeah. I just want you to be clear there. Well, are you up, Christy?
I'm happy to go. It's interesting that we're having this conversation about kind of the interface of those, because mine and my where my paper is kind of centering around is all about that interface. It is all about the nature, not just of the leader, but of the follower. I haven't found a better word, but participants. So anyway, mine is all about kind of defining this model of leadership that is all about that relationship and how that is defined. And as far as my thesis statement goes, there's a sense in which Trinitarian theology provides an essential foundation for the understanding of ministry leadership. The work of the triune God is defined not only by the work itself, but by the relationship of that work and humanity. So so my thesis is, therefore, leadership that reflects a Trinitarian construct is defined by its invitational, mutually relational, and participatory nature. I've even shifted that a little since I first wrote it. So those three things are the invitational, the mutually relational, and the participatory nature. It's kind of what I will spend kind of helping define what I mean by that. So the introduction, I think we'll all probably have that in our papers, the similarities of kind of historical understandings, foundations of leadership, which then I move into giving a foundation of Trinitarian theology that's going to support that thesis. So understanding the kind of what we observe in the triune God, in the Trinity, what we observe. So the mutuality, the kind of the reciprocal existence of the three persons of the Trinity, this idea of unity and diversity, kind of separate but the same. The functions are distinct, and yet there is kind of an intertwined existence of them, and kind of what that looks like regarding kind of the shared authority. As we talk about the Trinity, there are things that we attribute to certain aspects of it, but what does that mean as far as the shared authority within those within those three aspects of the Trinity, using some of the review and leadership pieces in there. And again, just this idea of intrinsically tied to, independent on the community relationship. There's an absolute necessity for the collective, I guess is a good word, and I'll flesh that out a little bit down further in the paper, but and the fact that there's this notion of invitational and not coercive, and kind of looking at how that's defined within the Trinity's call to the role of humanity in the work of God and what that looks like. So essentially this piece is kind of laying the foundation for moving into then kind of redefining or defining the idea of leader and follower. And so if we have that as our basis, as our foundation, it moves from this hierarchy, from kind of where the hierarchy is, where everything is defined more to relationship and that mutuality and what that looks like. Using some of the fittest, this idea of authority versus power, particularly in my context, even this week, as I have just sent out my 6th email to students that they are to set up a meeting with me, the idea that just because you are a leader, that people are going to listen to you and be involved in the work is not the case anymore, particularly in my context. And so we have to redefine what that looks like. So authority versus power and how that is. And then giving some common language of the nature of mutuality and what that means for the person who is considered the leader, and what that means for the follower or the congregant, or however you want to say it. Kind of this, essentially, these first two sections, or these two sections, are all about giving some articulation that I'll be pulling from in the rest of it. So this idea of mutuality, and then the constructs of leadership, really fleshing out those three ideas of invitational, mutually relational and participatory, and that gets more into the missional leader. That's kind of the how-to of the paper and what it looks like. What does it mean if you come from a Trinitarian perspective of leadership? What does that mean for how to share vision? What does that mean for becoming the work of collaboration? What does that mean? How do you collaborate as mutually as entities in the process? How does that work? So using again the Trinitarian idea of the work of God and humanity's role in that, and how we are invited into that, and how we as leaders invite people into the work and what that means. Mutually relational, this idea of distinctive roles yet tied to the kind of the interdependent relationship. There is a notion that my South African friends talk about. It's Ubuntu. I am because you are, and I do not exist outside of you, and you do not exist outside of me. And so that relationship, really highlighting how we foster that as leaders, how we pull people into that. And again, a lot of that is the missional leader component on kind of what that looks like and how that's fleshed out. And then this moving from kind of a theoretical, how we're tied together, to this idea that of action, of participation on all sides, and how we become mutually vested and share the action of the dance, using some of that piece, and talking a little bit about those practices of faithfulness and service that we found in reviewing leadership, and how we become collaborators, co-creators in the work, and so this paper, and then of course the conclusion will be kind of tying all that up. But again, this is really as much about moving away from this idea of leadership, and then how you dispel information, and how you work to bring people into your vision, and how for me in my context, how we get students to be in a certain place, but more about how that shared agency changes the way that we look at leadership as a whole, and kind of highlighting that interface throughout. That is all.
Christy, I was thinking, I was thinking back to the posting that you all were doing a couple weeks ago. This isn't directly related, or at least I guess I should have made maybe better notes from some of those postings, but I know that one of the things I thought that you did so well in those postings, both with your own and as you were responding to some of your classmates, was to identify tensions in some things, how two ideas sometimes would be in tension with each other, but yet you were pulling from both of those and trying to understand how those were being woven together. So I'm not making a specific comment about what's on here, I guess. None of those jumped out on me on here, but I was thinking I would go back and reread some of the posting that you did, looking for some of those. And I guess maybe you are partly naming the tension between leadership as a model that we've all become comfortable with in a certain way, and then the tension of reframing that and reshaping that. But I know there was some really nicely phrased things that you did in some of that posting, where you were really attentive to ways that some things are in tension with each other, and how we walk into that and live into those tensions. So I just would encourage you, as you're looking at your paper, to be continuing to look for those and highlight those. I thought those were important in the posting that that you guys did. So
Thanks, for sure.
This statement will relate to your writing, Christy, but perhaps also to Jay's, where you talk about authority versus power. And I know that's something that Hittis has spent quite a bit of time on, but I don't want us to shy away from the notion of power.
Mm-hmm.
It is something we become stewards of. And even as we talk about giving everything away as the outflow of God into the triune relations that God continues to pour itself out, but it is not self-abnegation, nor is it disempowerment. And so how we think about authority and power, I think, needs to be nuanced in a particular way. I do like the way in which you are moving past hierarchy, and many people have a hierarchical trinity, as you know. And so beginning to talk about this participation that God welcomes in God's own life, and it becomes a circular, a kind of perichoretic movement, of course, which flattens hierarchical relations, even though God remains God and we are not. And so we need to retain the notion of, even though we participate in God and we are partakers of divinity, there still is a power differential, even though God is inviting us to be stewards of the empowerment that's been granted us. And so just how we deal with authority and power, I think, requires quite a bit of attentiveness as we think about the difference in human and divine.
And yeah, I think that's a really good word. I think as I am kind of considering that notion, in my kind of chicken scratch on that, one of the things that the tension, Sherry, that you were talking about is how do we as leaders, exactly what you're talking about, just handle power and still invite participation, without just becoming solely a participant in the process, like still being the leader. How do you invite collaboration but still be,
that's right,
still be the leader, and how do you do that? And that's good.
Yeah, good. And quite frankly, as much as we want to be egalitarian in congregational life, also there is a power differential between the pastoral leader, the university minister, and those whom you're leading, even as you are seeking to empower them, but there's still a power differential. And that's why we are stewards. We have to be stewards of the power that comes by virtue of the role. I really like invitational, mutually, relational, participatory. I mean, that's a real good outworking of Trinitarian relations. And what you have not done, and one can certainly do it as you were doing, you've not entered this portal of Trinitarian relations through Christology, through the sending one, or through pneumatology. You are simply beginning with the communal relations, and that's a way to do Trinitarian work. And so I'm just commending you for your methodology. You can take out those first 5 weasel words. There is a sense in which, no, it's a declarative statement. Trinitarian theology provides an essential foundation for the understanding. I'm just fooling with you a little bit there, but a thesis statement ultimately becomes, hey, I'm all in on this. This is a declaration of what I believe I'm going to do. This is the theological conviction that undergirds this extended essay. So,
Thanks.
yeah. And Jay, I'm hoping you took counsel on that notion about authority. You did write stands against power and oppression, and that's where I want you to nuance.
I did. I made a note of that.
Stand against abuse of power, but
Yeah, I would definitely add a clarifying word in front of power there.
good.
Thank you.
Sherry, how are you going to give feedback to Richard? He will be listening to this. Should we give a little feedback in his absence?
Yes, I asked his permission if it would be okay for us to do that, and he said that would be fine. So I don't know if you all, I have his in front of me. I don't know if the rest of you, did you make copies to have in front of you?
I haven't.
Okay. So, yeah, he said that would be fine if we wanted to look at it and give him some feedback. He will be listening. So I would say I also went back and printed from Richard's posting, and his posting, I think many of you will remember, was really focused on deconstructing the hierarchical leadership, which he talked about some in class as well, but talked about a leadership construct which follows traditional leadership models will inevitably subjugate, disavow, and devalue someone. Do you remember that writing from his posting? And he really wanted to make an argument for churches, even though they think they're doing good, when they can also, in the midst of that, be establishing structures which are dominating and suppressive, even when they think they're doing a good thing. And then he gave examples of churches where that might be happening. White churches thinking they're inviting their black brothers and sisters into the process when they're really still over above. Also examples of how that happened with women. And then he took some biblical examples, and in that posting argued for their modeling Trinitarian leadership. So, he's wanting to offer a counter narrative to the top-down leadership seen in the Constantinian model, which, he discussed some of that in class too. So I was just looking for a few other words to kind of give a little more depth to the outline that he presented.
I think it's,
for leadership to be effective, it must be missional. And then he talks about creativity. One of my favorite sentences from what his posting was, the idea that something new and fresh is possible is exactly where the intersection of Trinitarian theology and leadership meet. Yeah. So I think he's wanting to express that in claiming this Trinitarian model and that being leadership, something new can happen there because of the way we claim that. So I just wanted to say a few more words to maybe help.
Yeah.
With the outline.
I think there needs to be a little more delineation. Is he claiming that all of the Johannine literature is going to be consulted, and that's much too ambitious? The writings of the Apostle John, well, most likely there's a Johannine community at Ephesus that constructs the fourth gospel. And so I would like if he's going to try to draw it all from Johannine corpus needs to be a little more limitation
Right.
than the whole of it. It's too much. I was also curious as to why friendship does not surface as a key modality in ministry leadership from within the gospel, at least, of John. There's and you have a dialectical Christological vision in the gospel. And so he's going to be cherry picking. I fear you have the highest Christology of any of the Gospels there, and you might not be able to argue that the Constantinian model is utterly flattened in the Johannine writing. I mean, he's going to have to cherry pick to make this case, because Jesus is rather imperious in the gospel. Nobody takes it from me. I lay it down. He is not the victim as he is in the synoptics. He is self-determining to the very end. And so there's a real tension between the self-giving friend and the one who is very much the pre-existent one who is self-determining in terms of how he moves toward his death. And so I just want to warn Richard that it's a little more complicated if you're trying to rely on the whole of this gospel. You can get missional, relational, you can get incarnational, but can you really flatten a notion of leadership from this gospel? Just my musings.
Okay. All right.
I'd like to see him try.
Paul, do you want to present your outline for us to think about?
Is Laloy still with us?
Yeah,
Okay.
this is my time, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I think I will need some feedback from you very much, because I took my thesis statement and outline is from the classroom, what I understand from the subject, and then the book I read. So my thesis statement is in pastoral leadership, servanthood leadership with good character. That's what we can see in Jesus' life is very important. We will be the heart of obedience and relational, and then love dominated, which is reflect from the Trinitarian God in leadership, I think. Yeah, that is my thesis statement. And then the outline, what I write is that first introduction, and then number one, leadership, which is like relational, communicational, and living, something like that. So is more on what I plan to write is the meaning of leadership, something like that. And then the second one is more on biblical leadership, which we can see in Moses, Joseph, and David, and then especially in Paul's life. Paul said leadership is proclaiming the gospel, something like that. So, and then here I would like to add that Trinitarian leadership, the topic will be, the outline will be Trinitarian leadership, and then servant leadership, which I really want to focus in Jesus' life. And then the qualification of leadership and leadership discipline. It means the ethic of leadership. Many pastors, many leaders are very good in leadership, but they are something that, like David, the peril of David, the peril, the pitfall of leader. Some character moral is not good, so they are not really good leaders. So I just want to write here the leadership discipline, and then conclusion. That is what I plan to write for my ministry, my theology of leadership, my theology of leadership ministry. Yes, leadership ministry. Especially, yes, heart of obedience and relational, and then diverse but unity, which will be focused in the ministry leader in the church, which is reflect from the Trinity, the Trinitarian relationship, which is based on obedience, love, and unity. That's what I plan to write. Yeah. Do I make sense? I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I just I'm wondering, Laloy, how it seems like you could have written this paper without ever attending the class, because the kinds of statements about biblical leadership, servant leadership, leadership discipline, I mean, these are ideas that you already have, and with biblical examples, etc. And so it's not clear to me where missional theology, Trinitarian theology really is going to undergird your understanding of leadership. I think you're going to need to make sure that some of the theological work we did in class and informs your theology of ministry leadership. It's not real clear to me on the basis of this outline.
Yes, yeah, it's maybe true, but I read, especially Reviewing Leadership, this book. That's what I got the idea from leadership, and then I just do it for the outline, and then what I have learned from the class. Yeah, that's true. Maybe, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's the theological piece. Maybe you can say that in a better way, Sherry.
Okay. Well, I think the work from I think you acknowledged that you needed to add the section about Trinitarian leadership in your outline. So you've noticed that was missing. And the work that we did from Dr. Marshall's book and from the Fittest book that talk about that Trinitarian understanding. There's also the outlines, that we did in class that have some really maybe helpful pieces as well, but you'll need to add, pieces from those books to show. So servant leadership, and I know reviewing leadership had some really nice pieces in it, but to show how understanding a Trinitarian theology, how does that flesh that out? How does that shape that understanding of leadership for you? So
Okay.
it might be, if you want to keep working on an outline or kind of
Yes.
keep working on some pieces, you could send that to me again, and we could take a look at it
Okay.
as you're trying to understand how to add and how to develop some of these pieces in here.
Okay, ma'am. Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay.
I'll do it. Yes, and then I will post it in the Zoom class, right? In the Zoom here. I'll keep doing it. What you said. Maybe. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? I think was the paper due in about a week and a half now? I don't have my timeline right here in front of me, but
The 26th,
26th. Okay.
I think.
What was the 23rd?
And
Okay.
I think it's funny. I probably didn't plan that very well, but I think we actually have another Zoom session the day the paper is due. So what you should take that as is that you got a lot longer to write your paper than the original class did last year. So not that, why did she schedule both those the same day, but that, wow, we got a whole extra few days to get our paper turned in. So I think that's how that happened, than just with scheduling them when we could get that next Zoom session in. So okay.
I really like you all writing kind of with the end in mind, that you are thinking about possible dissertation project, and that how this kind of theological foundation that you're articulating now can be incorporated, and the grounding for what you actually do later. And so starting with that end in mind is a very good thing.
Okay. Ma'am, let me ask you some help that I will need. Can you give me something that I am going to write for my outline for hint?
Why don't you work on another outline, another proposal, and send it to me, and we can start with that.
Another outline, not like okay.
Go back to your to some of the class notes, and go back to joining the dance, and think through the things that we said about Trinitarian theology, and work a little bit more on an outline, developing some of your understanding from that of Trinitarian theology, and then send that again, and then we can take a look at it sometime in the next couple of days. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Well, I found anything else we want to do before we get out of here? Okay. I did find, as I was looking through my Upper Room Worship book, I spent last week at Spiritual Formation Academy, and we do our worship from what's called the Upper Room Worship book. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I found a psalm prayer at the end of that I thought I would share with us as we close. This is a 2nd century adaptation of Psalm 139. It is not you who shape God. It is God who shapes you. If then you are the work of God, await the hand of the artist who does all things in due season. Offer the potter your heart, soft and tractable, and keep the form in which the artist has fashioned you. Let your clay be moist, lest you grow hard and lose the imprint of the potter's fingers. Bless you as you go from here.
Amen.
I'll be
Right.
checking my email, so if there's anything I can do, let me know.
Sherry, stay on because I want to
Okay.
visit with you after
Sure.
everybody else goes home.
All right.
Thank you.
Bless you all.
Have a good day, everyone.
Okay.
Blessings.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pause this recording here.